Elena stood on the curb of a rain-slicked Chicago street, her hand instinctively clutching the heavy swell of her 8-month pregnant belly. The wind whipped her hair across her face as her husband Julian ushered her into a waiting taxi. He leaned in, giving her a hurried, clinical kiss on the cheek, murmuring something about an emergency board meeting he couldn't miss. As the heavy door thudded shut, Julian didn't notice the silence coming from Elena. He didn't know she had left her phone in the deep crevice of his back seat, and he certainly didn't know that 3 seconds before the taxi pulled away, she heard his car's Bluetooth snap to life. A woman's voice, sharp and mocking, filled the interior of his sedan, laughing as she asked if the ball and chain was finally gone. The words that followed turned Elena's world to ash. "Our flight leaves in 2 hours, hurry up." Elena watched the red taillights of her husband's car disappear into the gray mist, realizing that every "I love you" she had heard for years was a calculated lie. Welcome to today's story. If you enjoy emotional drama and shocking twists, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more unforgettable stories. And before we begin, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. To understand how Elena ended up on that lonely, wet curb, you have to look back at the cracks that started forming 6 months ago. At the time, life seemed like a dream. Elena and Julian lived in a beautiful home in the suburbs, a place filled with high-end furniture and the quiet hum of success. Julian was a rising star in the corporate world, and when they found out Elena was pregnant with their first child, it felt like the final piece of a perfect puzzle. But the perfection was a thin veneer. The shifts were subtle at first. Julian started staying later at the office. His phone was suddenly face down on the nightstand. The warmth in his eyes when he looked at Elena began to cool, replaced by a distracted, almost clinical air. Then came the real catalyst for the change: Lydia. Julian's mother moved in under the guise of helping Elena during her high-risk pregnancy. Lydia was a woman who moved through a room like she was inspecting a crime scene. She was impeccably dressed, deeply traditional, and possessed a unique talent for delivering insults wrapped in a smile. She didn't just move into the guest room, she moved into the marriage. Elena was a senior data analyst by trade. Her brain was wired to look for patterns and anomalies. She was used to things making sense. But under Lydia's roof, logic started to warp. Lydia began a systematic campaign of psychological warfare. She would move Elena's prenatal vitamins and then claim Elena had forgotten where she put them. She would insist she had told Elena about important appointments, only to look on with pity when Elena appeared confused. "It's just the pregnancy brain, dear," Lydia would sigh, patting Elena's hand while glancing at Julian. "It's a shame how it affects the memory. We'll have to keep a closer eye on things." Julian didn't defend her. Instead, he leaned into his mother's narrative. He started treating Elena like she was fragile, not out of love, but out of a growing impatience. The man who used to rub her feet now barely asked about her day. He became a stranger who lived in her house, a ghost who only materialized to offer a polite, empty smile before retreating into his office. The pressure wasn't just mental, it was becoming structural. Elena noticed Julian and Lydia huddled in the kitchen late at night, their voices dropping to a whisper the moment she entered. They were making decisions about the nursery, the birth plan, and even her own finances without her input. When she tried to set boundaries, Lydia would cry about her sacrifices, and Julian would accuse Elena of being hormonal and ungrateful. Elena felt a suffocating sense of isolation growing within her own walls. Standing on that street corner in the rain, the shock of the car phone conversation acted like a lightning strike. The fog Lydia had tried to cast over her mind evaporated in an instant. The emergency meeting was a lie. The loyal husband was a fraud. Julian was going to an airport with another woman, leaving his heavily pregnant wife behind in a taxi like a piece of unwanted luggage. Elena leaned forward, her eyes cold and sharp as the Chicago wind. She looked at the taxi driver through the rearview mirror. Her voice didn't shake. It was the voice of a woman who had just stopped being a victim and started being a hunter. "Change of plans," she said firmly. "Follow that black Mercedes, and don't lose him." Elena stared out the taxi window as the rain lashed against the glass, blurring the neon lights of the Chicago skyline. Her hand remained on her belly, feeling the rhythmic, anxious thrum of her own heart. She thought back to the quiet, upscale life she and Julian had shared just a few months ago, before the silence in their home became heavy with unspoken secrets. It wasn't long after she reached her 3rd trimester that the atmospheric pressure of her marriage shifted. Julian started coming home with a look of distant pity, as if Elena was a problem to be managed rather than a partner to be loved. The real invasion began when Lydia, Julian's mother, moved in with 3 designer suitcases and a smile that never reached her eyes. Lydia was a woman who practiced the art of the backhanded compliment, constantly reminding Elena how lucky she was that Julian was so patient with her condition. Every morning, Lydia would rearrange the kitchen, moving Elena's essential prenatal supplements to the highest shelf. When Elena couldn't find them, Lydia would sigh loudly, glancing at Julian with a look of stage concern. "It's the cognitive decline that comes with pregnancy, Julian," she would whisper loud enough for Elena to hear. "She's becoming quite forgetful. It's a heavy burden for a man in your position." Julian didn't just listen, he started to believe it. He began treating Elena like a child who couldn't be trusted with her own life. He took over the passwords to their joint investment accounts, claiming he wanted to spare her the stress of financial management. He became a shadow in their own home, always whispering with his mother in the hallway. Elena, once a high-performing data analyst who managed millions in assets, found herself trapped in a nursery that felt more like a cell. She was surrounded by high-end wallpaper and expensive cribs, yet she had never felt more invisible. The humiliation wasn't just quiet, it was constant. During a dinner with Julian's colleagues, Lydia leaned over and cut Elena's steak for her, telling the table that Elena's pregnancy brain made her clumsy with knives. Julian laughed along, patting Elena's hand as if she were a pet. In that moment, Elena felt the first spark of an awakening. She realized that they weren't protecting her. They were erasing her. They were building a narrative of her incompetence, piece by piece, and she was let them do it because she was tired and vulnerable. But the data analyst inside her was still awake. She began to notice the inconsistencies in Julian's late nights at the office, and the way he looked at his phone with a predatory sort of hunger. She realized that Lydia wasn't just there to help. She was there to witness. They were a team, and their goal was far more sinister than just a broken heart. As the taxi continued to shadow Julian's Mercedes, Elena pulled out a small spare phone she had hidden in her maternity bag weeks ago. She had been tracking the household's Wi-Fi logs in secret, but what she saw now on the screen made her breath hitch. Julian hadn't been calling a business associate. He had been in constant contact with the family's estate lawyer, a woman Elena had once trusted as a friend. Swipe through the latest intercepted messages until she found a file that turned her blood cold. It was a draft for custody petition, and the woman on the other end of the phone wasn't just a mistress, she was the one Julian was choosing to raise Elena's baby. The taxi followed Julian's black Mercedes through the heavy evening traffic, keeping a calculated distance of 2 cars. Elena sat in the back, her breath hitching as they neared a boutique hotel near O'Hare Airport. She watched through the rain-streaked window as Julian pulled into the valet circle. A woman emerged from the lobby, her gait confident and her tailored suit impeccable. It was Sarah, the family's trusted estate lawyer. Elena's heart hammered against her ribs as she witnessed them exchange a kiss, a cold, businesslike gesture that felt more transactional than romantic. It wasn't just an affair, it was a partnership. Elena instructed the driver to pull into a nearby cafe across from the hotel entrance. She chose a seat by the window, her hands trembling as she pulled out her laptop. As a data analyst, she had always viewed numbers as the only objective truth. Weeks ago, she had noticed small, odd transfers from their joint household account to an entity she didn't recognize. Now, sitting in the dim light of the cafe, she began to intercept Julian's digital paper trail using the remote access she had never revoked from his home office. The data began to unspool on her screen like a confession. Julian and Sarah weren't just planning a life together. They were systematically hollowing out Elena's world. She found evidence of monthly transfers to a shell company registered in Delaware, which then moved funds into offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. Julian was siphoning off her inheritance, money her father had built through a lifetime of honest work. He was stripping her of her financial security while she was at her most vulnerable, carrying his child. The realization hit her with a weight that made it hard to breathe. The man who had promised to protect her was treating her life's work as a resource to be liquidated. But the data analyst in her didn't let the pain win. She began to copy the transaction logs, the IP addresses, and the wire transfer confirmations. She was no longer just a wife being discarded. She was a professional building a case that no charm could explain away. Suddenly, Julian's forgotten phone buzzed in her maternity bag. A new message appeared on the lock screen. It was from his mother, Lydia. The words were short and chilling. Did she sign the medical release yet? We need it before the flight. Elena stared at the screen, her blood turning to ice as she realized the business trip Julian was taking wasn't just a getaway. It was part of a final strategy to ensure she could never fight back. Elena returned home before the rain could wash away the tracks of Julian's Mercedes from the driveway. She walked through the front door with a practiced mask of exhaustion, playing the role of the compliant, foggy-headed wife they had worked so hard to create. Lydia was waiting in the kitchen, her silhouette framed by the amber glow of the pendant lights. She held a glass of green juice in one hand and a thick stack of papers in the other. The house felt smaller than usual, the walls closing in with the weight of the secrets Elena now carried in her maternity bag. "You look dreadful, dear," Lydia said, her voice smooth and clinical. She stepped forward, placing a hand on Elena's shoulder that felt more like a restraint than a comfort. "Julian is so worried about you. He called to say your memory was slipping again at the curb. It's a heavy burden for him, handling the firm while you're in this. State." Lydia set a vitamin schedule on the counter and slid a document toward Elena. She claimed it was just standard hospital registration paperwork for the delivery. Elena's eyes, sharpened by years of auditing financial anomalies, scanned the text immediately. It wasn't a registration form. It was a comprehensive power of attorney and a voluntary medical admission waiver. If she signed this, Lydia would have the legal authority to commit Elena to a private psychiatric wing for postpartum psychosis the moment the baby was born. They weren't just waiting for her to fail. They were architecting her disappearance. "I can't think straight, Lydia," Elena whispered, injecting a tremor into her voice that she didn't have to fake entirely. Lydia leaned in, her eyes glinting with a predatory triumph. Thinking Elena was too sedated to understand, Lydia let the mask slip. "Don't worry about thinking, Elena. We've done all the thinking for you. Once you're in the ward, the baby will be safe with me, and Julian can finally focus on the life he deserves." The casual cruelty of the admission confirmed everything the car Bluetooth had whispered. Lydia pressed a designer pen into Elena's hand, her fingers cold against Elena's skin. Elena looked at the signature line, then at the vitamins Lydia had prepared. She knew that every decision in this marriage had become a calculation of control rather than a gesture of love. She realized then that family loyalty was often just a word for a cage. Slowly, Elena leaned over the counter and put the pen to the paper. She signed her name with a steady hand, but Lydia didn't notice the faint, shifting shimmer of the ink. Elena had used a disappearing ink pen she'd kept from her data security days, a tool for a woman who knew the truth was about to vanish from the page. As Lydia snatched the paper away with a satisfied smirk, Julian's forgotten phone in Elena's bag vibrated with a final confirmation. The flight to the Caymans was booked, but the person boarding it was about to find their destination had been rerouted by a wife who was no longer playing a game of chance. Elena didn't waste a single second after Lydia tucked that worthless, signed paper into her purse with a look of victory. She waited until the front door clicked shut and Julian's Mercedes pulled out of the driveway, headed for the airport flight that would change everything. Moving with a sharp, cold focus, Elena slipped into her home office and retrieved her encrypted laptop. She reached out to a high-powered divorce attorney her sister had vetted, a man who specialized in unmasking high-net-worth fraud and dismantling the complex cages men like Julian tried to build. Elena knew that in this world, dignity wasn't just found in a feeling, it was forged in a strategy. The silence of the house became her greatest ally as she began documenting the months of Lydia's psychological abuse. Elena had installed a series of tiny motion-activated recorders in the kitchen and the nursery weeks ago, suspecting the whispers behind her back were actually a script for her destruction. As she listened to the playback, she heard Lydia's voice, clear and jagged, coaching Julian on how to frame Elena as mentally unfit. Lydia even laughed about how she would eventually take the baby for herself, once Lena was safely locked away in a private ward. While Julian was busy boarding a plane to the Cayman Islands to finalize his offshore account setup, Elena was busy tracing his digital footprints. She discovered that the emergency trip was actually a rendezvous to link her inheritance funds to a series of shell corporations. But the most sickening revelation came when Elena cross-referenced Julian's private messaging app. She realized that Sarah, the lawyer mistress, was also being lied to. Julian was telling Sarah that the inheritance was legally his and that he planned to dump his mother in a state-run home as soon as Sarah helped him secure the wealth. Elena sat in the nursery, the moonlight catching the silver curves of the crib. She realized that Julian's loyalty belonged to no one but his own greed. He had built a life on the assumption that everyone around him was too weak or too blind to see his math. But Elena was a data analyst, and she was already 3 steps ahead. She felt a profound sense of awakening. She was no longer a victim waiting for a blow to land. She was an architect designing a reckoning. As she finalized her files, she found Julian's exit strategy itinerary, a folder hidden in a deep cloud drive. He didn't just plan a vacation. He planned to leave the country permanently 3 days after the baby was born. He was waiting for her to deliver, waiting for her to be at her most vulnerable, before he disappeared with her legacy. Elena's hand tightened around her phone as she realized exactly how little time she had left. She had to move now, before the physical weight of her pregnancy became a barrier she couldn't cross. Elena moved through the silent house with the precision of a ghost. The weight of her 8-month pregnancy was no longer a burden, but a shield, grounding her as she executed her plan. She spent the night in the guest room Julian thought was her medication sanctuary, but instead of sleeping, she was purging their shared history. She gathered every original deed, her father's antique watch he'd lost, and the encrypted ledger Julian hadn't realized she had cloned. Every item she packed into her hospital bag was a piece of her stolen dignity being reclaimed. She realized that self-respect wasn't about shouting the truth. It was about securing the evidence so the truth couldn't be ignored. At 4 a.m., Elena sent a secure message to the private investigator she had hired through her attorney. She provided the GPS coordinates of Julian's emergency board meeting, a luxury suite where he was currently meeting with the family's rogue estate lawyer, Sarah. Elena watched on her screen as her investigator intercepted Julian's outgoing wire transfers in real time. He was attempting to move the final $5 million of her father's legacy into a Cayman Islands account. Elena's heart hammered, but she didn't panic. She simply triggered the dead man's hand protocol she had coded into the firm's server weeks ago, which would freeze all outgoing capital the moment he tried to finalize the deal. Suddenly, a heavy thud came from the hallway. Elena froze, her hand instinctively going to her belly. The guest room door creaked open and Lydia stood there, her eyes narrowed and a silver tray in her hands. "Still awake, Elena? I thought I told you the blue vial would help with the restlessness," Lydia whispered, her voice dripping with a terrifying mock pity. Elena realized with a jolt that Lydia hadn't just been gaslighting her. She had been monitoring her internet usage from the basement router. Lydia set a fresh glass of water on the nightstand, her gaze fixated on Elena's open laptop. The silence that followed was a physical pressure. Lydia stepped closer, her smile finally vanishing to reveal the cold, predatory hunger underneath. "You've always been too clever for your own good, dear. But Julian is already at the airport. By the time he lands, your signatures will be verified, and you'll be exactly where you belong," Lydia hissed, reaching for the laptop. Elena pulled the device back, her eyes meeting Lydia's with a level of defiance the older woman hadn't seen in months. In that moment, the basement door downstairs slammed open, and the faint, unmistakable smell of gas began to waft through the air vents, accompanied by the high-pitched chirp of a smoke detector alarm Julian hadn't meant to trigger yet. The shrill, rhythmic chirp of the smoke detector cut through the heavy silence of the guest room like a serrated blade. Elena didn't flinch, even as the faint, sharp scent of gas began to drift through the vents, a toxic reminder of the trap Julian had set before fleeing to his meeting. She looked Lydia in the eye, seeing the older woman's predatory smirk falter for the first time. Lydia's hand was still outstretched for the laptop, her fingers trembling not with fear, but with the sudden realization that the hormonal, confused girl she had bullied for months was gone. Elena stood her ground, her pregnant belly a physical barrier between her dignity and Lydia's greed. "The gas was a clumsy touch, Lydia," Elena said, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous calm. "Julian always did lack attention to detail." Downstairs, the garage door groaned open. Julian hadn't made it to the airport. Elena checked her phone. The dead man's hand protocol she'd triggered had worked. Every account Julian had tried to drain was frozen. His credit cards declined at the private airfield, and the flight he intended to take with Sarah was now a grounded memory. Elena watched the security feed on her laptop as Julian stormed into the kitchen, his face a mask of shock and fury. He looked like a man who had realized he'd been playing chess against a grandmaster while he was still learning how to move the pawns. The power dynamic in the house shifted in an instant, the air thick with the smell of brewing consequences and gas. Lydia stepped back, Her heels clicked frantically on the hardwood as she shouted for her son. Julian burst into the guest room, sweating and panicked, his charcoal suit rumpled. He saw Elena sitting on the edge of the bed, the digital evidence of his fraud glowing on the screen. "You set us up," Julian rasped, his voice cracking. Elena didn't shout. She didn't need to. She simply held up the small digital recorder that had captured Lydia's confession about the medical waiver and the ward. She realized then that self-respect was her real inheritance, more valuable than the millions Julian had tried to steal. The heater began to vibrate with a low, guttural growl as the pressure built in the rigged lines Julian had loosened earlier. Elena grabbed her pre-packed hospital bag, her movements slow but deliberate. She looked at the man she had loved for years and saw only a stranger wearing a mask. "I'm leaving, Julian," she said, her voice unshakable. "But before I go, you should know that Detective Miller is already at the dock, intercepting the shipment of my father's belongings you tried to export." As she turned to walk toward the stairs, a sharp, searing pain shot through her abdomen, stopping her mid-step. Her hand flew to her belly as the first real contraction of active labor hit, and the house groaned as the pilot light on the water heater prepared to kick on. The searing heat of the first contraction was so sudden that Elena's knees buckled, her hands clawing at the guest room dresser for support. Julian stood frozen in the doorway, the stench of gas from the basement now thick enough to taste, while the rhythmic hiss of the loosened water heater line growled through the vents. Lydia let out a jagged, hysterical laugh, her polished facade finally shattering into pure, unfiltered malice as she looked at Elena's crumpled form. "It's too late for the docs, Elena," Lydia hissed, her eyes darting to the smoke detector where the infrared glint of the camera Julian had installed watched them both. "The pilot light is going to kick on in minutes. You're having that baby in the dark, or you're burning with the evidence." A second wave of pain ripped through Elena, stronger than the first, grounding her in a terrifying new reality. She wasn't just fighting for her legacy anymore. She was fighting for the very first breaths of her child in a house rigged to become a tomb. She looked at Julian, seeing the man who had stir honey into her tea for 91 nights while calculating the cost of her disappearance. "Julian, the gas," he whispered, his voice trembling with a cowardice that made Elena's stomach churn. He looked at his mother, then at his pregnant wife, trapped between the monster who raised him and the family he was destroying for a life insurance payout. Elena forced herself to breathe, the analytical part of her brain overriding the panic. She realized then that Julian's control was an illusion built on her own silence, and that silence ended today. "The dead man's hand protocol is already live," Julian Elena rasped, pushing through the agony of the contraction. "If this house goes up, the dossier of your offshore accounts and Sarah's malpractice records goes straight to the FBI and the State Bar." She saw the color drain from Julian's face as the math of his betrayal finally turned against him. He wasn't a king. He was just a small, greedy man who had underestimated the woman he thought he'd erased. Suddenly, the front door was kicked in with a deafening crash that vibrated through the floorboards. Flashing blue and red lights cut through the rain outside, strobing against the nursery wallpaper like a strobe light of incoming justice. Detective Miller's voice boomed from the foyer, calling for an immediate evacuation. Julian panicked, grabbing the medical bag containing the high-dose sedatives he'd intended to use to silence Elena before the flight. He lunged toward her, the syringe glinting in the dim light, but another contraction hit Elena so hard she let out a scream that triggered the motion-activated alarm system. As Julian stumbled back, the water heater in the basement let out a low, guttural roar, and the unmistakable click of the pilot light attempting to ignite echoed through the vents. The explosion wasn't a roar, but a sharp, metallic pop from the basement that sent a shudder through the floorboards. Elena felt the heat of the air change instantly as Detective Miller's team tackled Julian to the ground, the blue glass vial in his medical bag shattering against the floor. Lydia screamed, a jagged sound of pure entitlement as officers forced her hands behind her back. "This is my house. You have no right." She shrieked, but her voice was drowned out by the urgent hiss of the fire suppression system Elena had secretly serviced weeks ago. Elena leaned against the hallway wall, her breath coming in shallow gasps as the physical reality of labor collided with the collapse of her marriage. Miller knelt beside her, his face a mask of professional calm. "Medics are right behind us, Elena. We have the car logs, the blueprints, and the manifest from the dock." Julian looked up from the floor, his eyes hollow with a sudden realization that his calculated life had been dismantled by the very woman he tried to erase. He watched, helpless, as Elena clutched her belly, her dignity shining brighter than the strobing police lights. She realized then that Julian hadn't just been stealing her inheritance. He had been gambling with the lives of his own children to pay off debts he was too proud to admit. In the back of the ambulance, wrapped in a shock blanket, Elena watched the gray Chicago rain wash over the driveway of the home that had become her prison. She felt a strange, quiet sense of healing. The fog hadn't just lifted, it had been incinerated. Every decision she had made to document the abuse, every hour spent palming pills and cloning ledgers, had led to this moment of absolute self-respect. She wasn't a ball and chain or a victim of pregnancy brain. She was a mother who had secured her children's future before they had even taken their first breath. By the time they reached the hospital, Elena's focus was singular. The betrayals of Julian and Lydia were now secondary to the rhythmic, powerful contractions that signaled a new beginning. She looked at Detective Miller, who stood by the intake desk. The ledger she rasped, handing him the encrypted drive from her bag. It has the master key. It will trigger the dead man's hand protocol the moment they try to access the offshore accounts. As they wheeled her toward the delivery wing, Elena's phone buzzed in her hand with a final alert from her private investigator. Sarah, the lawyer mistress, had just been detained at O'Hare with a suitcase full of forged deeds, and the signature on the top page was already beginning to fade. The Chicago spring air felt this year. It was crisp, clean, and carried the scent of blooming lilacs rather than the metallic tang of hospital halls or the suffocating weight of gas. Elena sat on a park bench, watching her one-year-old son, Leo, pull himself up against the wood. His laughter was a bright, rhythmic sound that grounded her in the present. She thought back to that night in the ambulance, a time when she felt like a footnote in her own life, erased by the man who promised to love her. But today she didn't feel like a victim of a pregnancy betrayal. She felt like an architect who had finally finished her masterpiece. Life for Julian and Lydia had become a series of cold, hard walls. Julian was currently serving 12 years in a federal facility for the systematic fraud and money laundering Elena had unmasked. His once expensive suits had been replaced by gray scrubs, and his charm had no currency in a cell where the math always stayed at zero. Lydia, stripped of the mansion she treated like a throne, was living in a cramped one-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of the city. Julian refused her collect calls, blaming her for the unfit plan that had backfired so spectacularly. They had tried to build a kingdom on Elena's silence, only to find that silence is a foundation made of sand. Elena, meanwhile, had found her voice in the very world that tried to quiet her. She was now a leading advocate for women facing financial and psychological abuse, using her data analyst skills to help legal teams trace hidden assets. She taught women that dignity isn't a feeling you wait for someone to give you. It's a boundary you draw with a steady hand. She realized that her father's real legacy wasn't the millions, but the resilience to survive a trap designed by those she trusted most. This empowered woman's story wasn't just about winning a court case. It was about the spiritual liberation of no longer caring what the vultures thought. As the sun dipped behind the skyline, Elena took a final look at a document in her bag. It was the confirmation of a massive donation. She had taken the portion of Julian's assets seized by the court and directed every penny to a shelter for pregnant women in distress. She wanted that money once intended for offshore greed, to instead provide a safe haven for mothers who felt like they were being owned in a taxi while their worlds crumbled. True revenge wasn't just taking what was theirs, it was taking their poison and turning it into a cure for someone else. She stood up, lifting Leo into her arms and feeling the strength in her own back. She was no longer defined by the 91 nights of drugged tea or the humiliations of a toxic mother-in-law. She had become someone Julian and Lydia could no longer touch. She walked toward her car, a woman who had reclaimed her time, her name, and her future. If you've ever felt like you were being sent away in a taxi while your world was crumbling behind you, remember? You are the driver of your own life. Subscribe to join our family of survivors and share your story of strength in the comments below. We would love to hear how you found your way back to the light.